Welcome to the KCOR Weekly Zoom presentation, number 184 in our series. My name is Nigel Weir, and I will be your host and moderator. Our speaker today is Brian Czech. Brian is an interdisciplinary scholar and founding president and executive director of the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, CASI. The title of his presentation is GDP as a Proxy for Ecological Footprint. GDP, a frequently mentioned measure of progress, has gained recognition as a poor indicator of social well-being. Brian will discuss how this measure can continue to be used. Welcome, Brian. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Nigel. I just want to say I love the Club of Rome and I love Canada. So here on Valentine's Day, we're checking all the boxes. All right. Yeah, GDP as a proxy for the ecological footprint. We have to go through some theoretical material to get to that point where we recognize it as such, as a proxy for the ecological footprint. And to start, we're all aware that as the economy grows, it's using our stocks of natural capital, liquidating the stocks of capital. And there will be pollution pursuant to laws of thermodynamics, both material and energy waste. And so, there's a limit to that. And that's why we at CASI, we advocate for the steady state economy, because growth is not sustainable and degrowth isn't sustainable either, of course. And so the carrying capacity is the question. It's one of the major questions. And then, and we recognize it's not going to be a flat line. It'll be, fluctuating and hopefully not too wildly fluctuating, and ideally around an optimum level, all things considered. The big question, this is a question that is a controversy, causes controversy even within the ecological economics community, is this: can we use GDP to indicate how close we are to carrying capacity? Or in other words, can capacity be put in terms of GDP? Or even more still, does GDP indicate the amount of environmental impact? And furthermore, GDP is put in monetary terms. And so can we use a monetary metric like GDP, a macroeconomic flow of money, to indicate environmental impact? All right, so and in fact, can we use money supplies, the supply of the global supply of money, to indicate how close we are to environmental capacity for the economy? And basically in this talk today, I'm going to be saying yes to those questions, but we need to back up a little bit and just talk about money for a few minutes. Money, of course, with the standard definition, it's a means of exchange, it's a unit of account, and it's a store of value. And it exists in an economy as a stock and a flow. There's a money supply, and then there are flows of money. And in terms of the money supply, the basic categories of those are the M0, the base money issued by a central bank. Those are simply the notes and coins in circulation and or in the central bank. M1 is the base money plus demand deposits, in other words, checking accounts. And then there are different additional levels of money supply where there's less liquidity there, and there are more complex instruments as we go up in those kinds of money supplies. money flows, there are various types. The one we're going to be talking about is the macroeconomic flow of money, gross domestic product. And there's a money flow index that some economists use as sort of a measure of enthusiasm of the stock market. There's cash flow index and microeconomics, of course. But we're concerned with GDP, which is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced annually within a country's borders. And it really helps to understand the implications, the meanings, the relationship of GDP to the environment when we think about what's called the fundamental identity of national income accounting, which is that production equals income equals, of course, expenditure. Sometimes people forget entirely about the production part of the identity, and identity in math is just a definition, essentially. So when we think about this, it makes it much easier to grasp what GDP is a measure of. It's a measure of the production, and production of what? Of final goods and services. And it's the income from the final goods and services. And by final, that means like the loaf of bread, not the yeast and the wheat flour that went into it. It's the final consumption item. And then it's the expenditure on those final goods and services. That's how GDP is measured. Now, of course, when you're measuring the production and income and expenditure on final goods and services, that's taking into account, by definition, the intermediate ones as well. You wouldn't have got to the final ones without the intermediate goods and services. So this is not GDP. The rolling of the wheels in a casino, at a slot machine, that doesn't contribute to GDP. The wages of the people working at the casino and the rents and so on, those do, but not that kind of activity. And similarly, the casino-like activity in a stock exchange is not part of GDP. You might say that it's a very loose metaphor here, but GDP is like the river, not those eddies and oxbows where a casino-like activity, swirling around can happen, swirling of money. It's the big flow in the body of the river that GDP is. And I guess it's worth mentioning the concept of the velocity of money, which is just defined as GDP over the money supply. And it's kind of an indicator of consumer confidence. And it's oddly sort of a predictor of future GDP, but it's thought to stay relatively constant in the long run. And we'll see how that may or may not be relevant in a few minutes. All right, so to recognize GDP as a proxy for ecological footprint, I want to talk about something that we call at CASI the trophic theory of money. And a theory of money, it should accomplish one or more of these things. First of all, it ought to help answer, how does money originate? And then how does the quantity of money relate to the quantity of real economic output? How's the quantity of money related to prices? And then how is quantity of money related to velocity of money? And the trophic theory of money has clear implications for each of these, but most, especially that very first question about the origins of money. And I like to quote Aristotle at this point. He said, "He who thus considers things in their first growth and origin will obtain the clearest view of them." And I think that the trophic theory of money helps us to obtain a clear view of what money really is and what it implies. And so, before we even look at the historical origins of money, the ecologists out there especially might recall that fancy phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is like the phenomenon in evolutionary biology whereby the development of an organism uh, tends to reflect the evolution of that origin, you know, from egg cell to the final uh, organism. It's very similar. If you took snapshots in time of the evolution of that species, it would sort of reflect that ontogeny. So the phylogeny is reflected by the ontogeny, by the growth of the organism. And it's going to be the same thing here. We're going to talk about the historical origins of money, and then we're going to recognize that this occurs year after year after year. Money originates via something that we're going to get to quickly. So money first originated classically in Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. It was 5,000 to 2,500, depending on evolution of the shekel, and also in Lydia, uh, close to 2,500 years ago, we had the first coins of electrum. That's a natural alloy of silver and gold. And then in China, not too much there, were copper coins. And what's really interesting is that each of these things were preceded by forms of what we might call proto money. And these were items that today we would view sort of like natural capital or agricultural types of products, agricultural and natural resource products, especially barley grains in Mesopotamia, oxen, for example, in Lydia, and in China and many other places, actually, cowrie shell and imitations of it. But now we're getting somewhere. We're going back even deeper in time, and we note that these exact same regions are are famous for the origins of something else as well, and that's agriculture. So Mesopotamia, you know, the birth of agricultural civilization all the way back to close to 10,000 years ago with those barley crops, and Lydia almost as anciently with more of a variety of foodstuffs, and China, you know, 7,400 years ago, especially with crops of millet. And so now we get to the trophic theory of money, which is that money originates via the agricultural surplus that frees the hands for the division of labor unto the manufacturing and service sectors. So no agricultural surplus, no manufacturing specialty, no service specialty, no anything else essentially, and certainly no money because there's no need for money. Money makes little to no sense in a condition without agricultural and extractive surplus. Now we call it the trophic theory of money because the real economy, the human real economy, reflects and it's a subset of what we can call the economy of nature with all those non-human species that start with the producers at the base. You know, those are the plants that literally produce their own food via the process of photosynthesis. And when you have enough surplus production of and for those producers, that's when you can have the evolution of species that consume producers directly. They consume plants. They're called primary consumers. And then when there's plenty of that ecological activity occurring, you can have, the evolution of secondary consumers as well, predators that eat primary consumers. And of course, this is a very simple set of trophic levels right here. And there's a tremendous amount of complexity that you can demonstrate with more of a food web type of diagram. But I really want us to think about trophic levels, so I'm keeping it simple with these three basic levels. I'm just going to mention the existence of service providers here things like pollinators and decomposers and things that aerate the soil. However, I put them kind of off to the side because they also are in a standard trophic level at any given time as well. All right, so this human economy has to have the same essential structure. You know, humans are a subset of the economy of nature, Homo sapiens, and they exist within this economy of nature. And you know, they're up here, they're omnivores, and so they kind of, you know, have a middling trophic level technically, but in the sense of being at the apex, in terms of being able to consume everything out there, that's where they would be, is at that apex. But then furthermore, they have their own, humans have a trophic structure in their own economy of agricultural and extractive activity at the base, and then the manufacturing that allows for, starting with the heaviest, like uh, 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 and the human economy reflects that economy of nature. You know, humans, that's Homo sapiens, and they follow the same basic laws of nature. And if you consider Homo sapiens as part of the broader economy of nature, well, technically, in terms of their trophic score, as it's termed, they're sort of middling in the trophic levels. They're omnivores. But in another sense, in another trophically relevant sense, they're at the apex, as humans are able to consume everything else out there, given our technology to conquer, you might say, everything else that's edible. Now, furthermore, Homo sapiens has its own subset of economy of nature. There's a human economy, and it reflects those trophic realities as well. It has a foundation of agricultural and extractive activity, logging, mining, commercial fishing. And this is where the extraction of fiber, in addition to food per se from the agricultural activity, transpires. So food and fiber, you know, it's required for food, clothing, and shelter. The basic survival is done there. And once there's a lot of that going on, and it's so well developed that there's a surplus of it where everybody doesn't have to be devoted to those activities, well, then you can start developing the manufacturing sectors from the heaviest all the way up to the lightest. So, you know, things like steel manufacturing and you know, sawmills producing lumber at the heavy manufacturing portion of the trophic structure, and then all the way up to, you know, all the production of little gadgets and some very highly developed ones in terms of the technology, like computer chips. But before you get to the whole point of all this, the whole point of the last several slides is that before you get this IT type production, you've got a lot of this at the base. You have to have a lot of that because you lose energy and materials as you move up those trophic levels. So it takes a lot of food and fiber and raw material surplus to have a fully fleshed out trophic structure as we know it today. So now the primary corollary of that trophic theory of money is that the quantity of money, and GDP as a macroeconomic flow of money, indicates the amount of agricultural surplus and the related activity at the trophic base. Remember, the related activity at the trophic base, those are the extractive activities. And I didn't mention specifically the energy extraction activities, but that's clearly part of that trophic base. But to keep it simply enough, like we did with the economy of nature, we lumped agricultural and extractive activity in one big trophic base. And so the prime implies that GDP is telling us, it's indicating it's of the economy, because for the economy to grow, that trophic base has to grow. That's the thermodynamic and ecological, the ecologically economic reality. And there's no way to grow that agro-extractive base without increasing the environmental impact. You can lessen environmental impact per unit of agricultural and extracted product gradually over time. That maybe is for another topic, the limits to that proportion. But you're not going to stop the increasing in environmental impact, because you're not going to be able to diminish the scope of that agricultural extractive activity, either in terms of area used or intensity per unit area. And, the last time I gave a K-Core talk, I showed some of these slides, but we're looking at the ones right now at that trophic base, the agricultural, and at this point in history, the very intensive agricultural activity required for the global population and $100 trillion GDP. Takes intense kinds of like this pivot agriculture, here seen from the air over Kansas, here seen on the ground in Kansas, and as well in Saudi Arabia, pivot agriculture. But the point I made last time was that, everywhere in the world where there's a lot of agricultural surplus, there are water issues, water shortage issues, even in areas where there's a lot of water, where you think, oh, there's tons of water there, where the rice is grown, or aquaculture has developed. There's water shortages now at $100 trillion global GDP. And, a lot of the water in California, where I sit right now, by the way, because of the Wildlife Society conference that was here a few days ago, a lot of that water in the Central Valley goes for dairy production. And then as you move into other types of domestic livestock, you can't but help see that direct impact on the land. There's no way to produce livestock without impact on the land. And, and the more livestock you want to produce to expand that trophic base, to have more money, that is more units that reflect the amount of real economic activity, well, the more intense the operations are going to be, and or the more land is going to be used. And there's a lot of places that really smell bad. I mean, I guess that's a relatively minor bad of GDP growth, but I sure have encountered them going across the Central Valley, I must say. And then when you get to the logging sector, that means clear cuts, or it means very few stands in Kings Canyon of old growth sequoia anymore. It's just a few little protected postage stamps now, where there's any sort of ecological integrity of big timber, big forest. Same with mining. You get mountaintop mining. You've probably seen, oh yeah, well, here they are, these famous photos of tar sand operations in Alberta. And then there's hydroelectric, trashing of rivers, and there's the risks that come along with other types of energy, including nuclear, and and then there's all of the dirty sort of infrastructural activities that accompany energy extraction and delivery. And only when you have a lot of that stuff are you going to have a lot of heavy manufacturing. Just a few scenes here of heavy manufacturing, some of which sort of grades with lighter manufacturing activities as well, in term when you're producing complicated products that do have that mix of heavy and light manufacturers. But then there's the light manufacturing per se, where you are producing very powerful and yet tiny units, but they're relatively meaningless unless they're going to be used for something, right? They're not used for anything economically relevant unless they're being used for all these other economic activities. So, the economy grows as an integrated trophic whole. That's the main point here. And that's why we call it the trophic theory of money. Yeah, and then the services. I forgot to mention the services. So when you look at this, you might think, well, this is how you get away from that heavy ecological footprint. But no, not at all. These are people that are just making the other activities from the agricultural and energy and extractive sectors on up even more intense. I mean, this guy here, he's dealing with some heavy equipment on rangeland right there. So, he may be a fire dispatcher. I'm stretching the metaphor a little, but the point is the service sectors, if they're not serving the rest of the economy, they're not going to be there. They're not going to survive the marketplace or the socialist government. Okay, so finally we get to this sort of where the rubber meets the road about as I called it in the title, a proxy, GDP as a proxy for the ecological footprint. Here's the actual formula based on a regression analysis we performed at Cassie. The ecological footprint is 934 times GDP to the 0.53. So, and it's a very, very strong regression model with an R squared of 0.97 and probability of this being random at practically nothing. Because this is accompanied, this regression equation is accompanied by this very ecologically economic causal hypothesis, the trophic theory of money. And so what this is telling us is, every unit increase of GDP, that's going to cause another half unit, like every percent of GDP increase will be about a 0.5%, a little more than a 0.5% increase in ecological footprint. And if you're wondering where the data came from, well, we used the Global Footprint Network's 2022 accounts, and we get the GDP data like most people do from the World Bank. We use the time series 1961 to 2018. We use least squares regression. Now, there are a few things that can mess with the formula, the regression model, the trophic theory of money implications. And those things are primarily here: inflation, technological progress, and international trade. But really, they're not a big deal. I mean, inflation we account for. You do that by using, chained dollars or dollars anchored to a particular year, to a particular CPI, Consumer Price Index. And so that's like a non-issue. I just put it here so there would be three things instead of two. Technological progress, that might sound like it could really complicate the relationship of GDP to environmental impact, but not so much. And K-Corps fellows, K-Corps principals, I would like to talk about this some months down the road, the relationship of GDP / environmental impact / ecological footprint to technological progress. I'll just say right here that the thing that gets overlooked all the time, it seems like, is that new technology, it's not manna from heaven. It comes about via a tremendous, strenuous amount of economic activity based on current levels of technology. So first you have to impact more of the environment to glean the next great thing in technology. This also stems from the trophic theory of money in the sense that it takes money to spend on the research and development that gives us technological progress. Research and development, R&D, that's like a $300 billion industry in the USA alone now. It has no light footprint. You see, that money, that $300 billion, that didn't come out of nowhere. That came from that trophic activity, including the additional 300 billion required of the trophic base. Not saying $300 billion worth of flour and lumber. I'm saying the proportionate requirement of the expansion of that trophic base to come up with 300 real billion dollars. And I'm bringing in that word real now to indicate that we are accounting for inflation. It's real money. It's not just the stuff that gets thrown out in a bill during COVID in order to, get people by for their next few months or whatever. That's what leads to inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods, going into debt and having a budget, having fiscal policy that's way beyond what is really warranted in terms of money supplies. Well, that is inflation. It's at least a definition, a recipe for inflation. In a way, it's kind of like the act of inflation, certain kind of inflation, because there are different kinds. There's like 4 rough categories, but anyway, it's like the most common one. We're trying to get yourself out of a fiscal shortage by pumping in more money to buy more stuff, but that money wasn't warranted. You don't have this expansion of the trophic base yet to warrant that. And we're running out of room for any more trophic expansion. So that's why inflation is such a sticky problem. It's not going away until we start recognizing limits to growth. Well, and then, excuse me, and then the third variable that can really affect how that regression equation, for example, how GDP is related to the ecological footprint and environmental impact, at least at a local or national level, is international trade. See, this regression model is based on global data, countrywide data. If you try to calculate if you try to measure the footprint in Singapore, for example, where there's a tremendous specialization on IT sectors and other service sectors, well, it gets a little distorted then. Singapore isn't producing nearly the proportion of its own food and fiber as other parts of the world. But in some of the really big countries like USA and China and Russia and Brazil and quite a few others, it stands as a within nation regression model as well. And finally, so we have a few really clear implications of the trophic theory of money and that regression model, which is that I want to call it more than a proxy. We can actually measure environmental impact with GDP because of the trophic structure of the economy and the trophic origins of money. And I alluded earlier to that the annual origins of money. I didn't say much about it, and then we had the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny thing. So annually, you have at the trophic base this pulse of grain crop, and the war in Ukraine is a real additional stress on real money supplies because there's a lot of wheat in particular that is at stake, and some other really key crops, some other really key foodstuffs And so that's another thing, adding globally to the stickiness of inflation, because we're like taking a chunk out of the trophic base. Putin is, you might say, Putin is taking a chunk out of the trophic base. Another implication is that, all right, so GDP, we have some of the most developed and most funded, most heavily manned agencies in the world are devoted to calculating GDP. It's done very carefully and very consistently. So it's it's a practice that's well established. Remember the fundamental identity of national income accounting. Production equals income equals expenditure. And at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, for example, where GDP is calculated, and in other agencies that calculate and do quality control, you have people working from those three approaches. You have production specialists, you have the income specialists, and the expenditure specialists. And those three accounts have to match, or they've done it wrong. They know that. And that's why it is such a great measure of environmental impact, because it's measuring that the production which starts at that trophic base. And furthermore, GDP is freely available. By that I mean literally free. It's free for us, let's say. I mean, not free, nothing is free. We pay our taxes, right? But I mean, it's going to be calculated already. So in that sense, it's available to us. So maybe we don't have to strain ourselves so much to do the calculation of ecological footprint. If we can't afford that at places and at times, we've got our measure of environmental impact. It's GDP. I'm not saying throw out the ecological footprint. It's a crucial concept. It really is. It helps us to understand in connection with the trophic theory of money, it helps us understand why GDP is such a great measure of environmental impact. So to conclude here, well, environmental protection is a steady state economy as measured with GDP. Oh, and by the way, I just have to add one thing. You see that thing in the background I mentioned being in California. See that little line of things below the windows there? Those are actually sheets taped together. There's 12 of them, indicating that we got 120 new signatures on the Cassie position on economic growth at this Wildlife Society conference here a few days ago, which just tells you how well the wildlife profession has come along and how wonderfully they understand the fundamental conflict between economic growth and environmental protection. And if there's anybody out here that hasn't signed the Cassie position, like those 120 new signatories from the conference, you please do that at steadystate.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, for a very concise presentation on money and GDP. And we will now move to questions from our participants. And let's see, I know we have the first question I would like to direct to is by John Mayer. We have nobody on deck after that at the moment, but I hope we will. John Mayer, go ahead.
Yeah, Brian, in terms of using GDP as an indicator of damage and exploitation, I think it can be used as a proxy for that. But I see the only way I can see us making rational investment decisions and consumption decisions is using biophysical economics, which is, as you point out, vastly harder because it deals with real physical units. And I think to understand what you need to do in the real biophysical world, you need to measure in those units, not in dollars. But I see the GDP impact, footprint metric as a useful signaling device. I don't see it leading to rational investment, rational actions on our part. So I guess that's the question. You can see it up there on the screen. Do you see the GDP footprint metric as a short-term fill-in, an alarm system, or do you see it able to produce biophysical rational decisions?
I absolutely do. GDP is, you saw the regression model results. It's like having the measure of the ecological footprint. Now, it takes a little biophysical insight, sure, to understand what that means on the ground, like, say, biodiversity loss.
Mhm.
But I feel that it's crucial to have a big picture, long-term, sort of one-size-fits-all macroeconomic, macroecological indicator too. Yeah, so I agree with you, John. In an ideal world, we have terabytes of information on which species are declining where and since when and exactly from which sectors of the economy, what in particular of all that economic activity is driving them out. But we also need, as like the big red flag, this one indicator, the best indicator we can come by of environmental impact and limits to growth. And I do see GDP as the most policy relevant one. Now, you said it may not drive investment decisions. That's true. But when it comes to managing for limits to growth, it's not all about investment. It's about regulation. It's about macroeconomic goals, macroeconomic policy goals. So I think that when we can recognize that GDP is the best macro measure of environmental impact, and we see left and right that our environmental impact is what's becoming the biggest problem of the 21st century. It already is in a lot of our accounts. Well, then it's time to change from the goal of GDP growth to either the steady state economy or even degrowth toward a lower steady state economy. And the longer we wait, more it would require that latter policy response.
Yeah. Okay. No, as a big red flag, absolutely. But in terms of exposing distortions, as you mentioned, the embedded carbon or embedded material in a specific society like Singapore or the UK, it exposes, it doesn't expose that, nor would it expose the distortion of ethanol, which has an EROI of somewhere between 0.7 and 1.4. So maybe Charlie is going to mention that, but anyway, so I'd be looking for more biophysical direct hooks. But until the powers that be get the message that we have to measure the real world, maybe that big red flag is something that we need to just hang out there. Anyway, okay,
Yeah,
thanks very much.
and I would say that the trophic theory money is biophysical macroeconomic. It's, and I think Charlie would agree with that. I'm guessing,
Okay.
because that trophic theory of money is all over it. A lot of that stems from ecological economics literature published by Charlie and the likes of Charlie, Herman Daly and Costanza and etc. But also infused with our own ecological, biophysical. Ecological is biophysical.
Okay.
And so our own ecological insights about the trophic structure of the economy and how the money supply has to reflect the level of real economic activity or it's inflated or deflated.
Love hearing your real economy versus the inflated money economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. David Doherty, please go ahead with your question. And next on deck is Ted Manning.
Hi, very interesting talk. By the way, to all the people who are watching, I did put a link in the chat to the position paper that you encouraged us to sign. And so I wanted to ask this question. Have we been expanding the human food supply by harvesting wildlife and wild plants? And will that reduce the capacity of ecosystems to generate food for us?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, there's a long, awful history of that. That is why the first wave of extinction, prehistorically, based on scholarship of Paul Martin and quite a few others, was the overhunting of Pleistocene megafauna after, especially in northern North America, but then eventually throughout the Americas, North and South, both. So that's direct harvest that drove a lot of the, like a woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and there's a long list of something like 30 some genera of those charismatic megafauna mammals that were driven to extinction after the Beringian migrations toward the end of the Pleistocene ice ages. But then bringing it up to like the beginning of the 20th century and much of the late 19th century, we had sort of a rinse and repeat, except with more modern technology, the wiping out of bison herds. And a lot of that wasn't just for food, that was for really a wasteful process for hides and stuff. But passenger pigeon, many waterfowl species plunged, so to speak, because of the market hunting. But now it's to the point where the other sorts of impacts, the environmental impact of that expanding trophic structure is a little less direct. It's the habitat loss. And it's that habitat is lost to most directly that agricultural and extractive activity. But any expansion of manufacturing and service activity, first of all, it participates directly. There's shop, there's office, there's infrastructure required directly of those sectors. But the really profound part, I feel, is that those sectors require more expansion of that agro-extractive base. So yes, we're we're reducing biocapacity. That's why in the global footprint networks approach, they're not only measuring ecological footprint, they're trying to measure biocapacity. And for that, we see one thing about GDP is we can alleviate some of the need to calculate in ecological footprint and let them focus more on that other critical metric of biocapacity, because it's ecological footprint divided by biocapacity that tells us where we are vis-a-vis carrying capacity. Tells us we're in overshoot now.
Yeah, okay. So because it's directly linked to the second question that I have, I want to pose this as a follow-up. Has anyone tried to estimate how much GDP the Earth can sustain for a century or more?
Yeah, well, yes, we have. I don't have the figures right in front of me, but it's basically what based upon biocapacity, how far our GDP is overshooting that. But I guess what you mean is the additional nuance of long-term, maintenance of biocapacity at a particular level. Not quite.
Yeah, that's true. But even instantaneously, we have something in excess of $1 trillion worth of GDP, I think, on an annual basis.
We could make a real crude back of the envelope calculation that capacity, assuming no major changes in capacity. The capacity for GDP would be in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 trillion. Based upon overshoot day. Actually, maybe more like 50 some trillion, because overshoot day now is back into July, right?
Okay,
So
and what is our current GDP globally?
Well, if they have accounted for inflation, evidently it's around 103 trillion.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm out by quite a bit. Okay.
If you go to steadystate.org, you'll see we have the rolling GDP meter right on our homepage. You can't miss it.
I'll go get it.
Yeah, and it's intended to be alarming, gosh, that thing just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning, and we're already beyond overshoot, GDP. It's relentless. So we need to, stop, slow that, and then steady it, and probably degrow it.
Yeah, 104 trillion. It's interesting that it rolls over, several times per second.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next, Ted Manning, please go ahead with your question. And
Okay.
after that, question from Charlie Hall.
As a heretic and not really an economist, just remember that's in the billions of quadrillions if you do it in Zimbabwean currency. But the big concern I've usually had in these kinds of approaches is that they are not adequately recognizing all of the other services which the ecosystem supports. And in a large percentage of them, they are not normally valued in a sense that people realize that they are life support systems, or that they are supporting stability, or that they are sustaining long-term stocks rather than just flows. In fact, I put in my question, how does this approach deal with stocks and flows when it's essentially a speedometer for consumption? So I'm being a heretic. Go for it.
Well, no, I think, Ted, what you're saying is very congruent with the presentation. The human economy expands at the competitive exclusion of those non-human species, economy of nature. So yes, we by the push for greater and greater GDP, we're literally driving out the other species, the stocks and flows of goods and services provided by the economy of nature. So it's sort of like it's a real stupid growth at this point in history. It's kind of suicidal, you might say. We're pulling out the rug from underneath ourselves and posterity. Yeah, I totally agree. And in fact,
we played a lot of games at IASA in interfacing supply and demand models to see whether or not there's any potential for optimization. And also playing around with an awful lot of different values to see which ones were in fact congruent with viable solutions. And bloody complex, quite frankly, but it did show the relative importance of an awful lot of important values that we generally are not able to consider effectively.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Okay, Charlie Hall, please go ahead. And after that, Raymond Lurie, you're on deck.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can,
Yeah.
Charlie.
Okay, I'm waiting for the mechanic to come out, so I might have to bail. It's a very simple question, Brian. In a democracy, as far as I can tell, every single politician is running on expanding the economy. How are you going to get your message out there in an economy that everybody else is operating to grow the economy? Whether they say it explicitly or implicitly, it's every politician, as far as I can figure, that's what he or she is saying.
Yeah, great question. Well, I can't see me anymore, so I'm not sure if I'm pointing to the right spot, but those signatures back there, that's one of our main methods for getting the word to the politician. I think there are two things that speak loudest to the typical politician: money and signatures. We don't have a lot of money, but we're very adamant about the signatures. We have like 16,000 plus signatures now and 250 organizational endorsements. And we need 160,000. We need 1.6 million of those things. Then as we get up in the food chain, if you will, in the trophic levels of impact politically, that's when we can expect some policy reform and also some, there was some leadership way back when Jimmy Carter was president. He tried to sort of resurrect the old conservation ethic that those of us who went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison learned about by reading Aldo Leopold books. The conservation ethic. What the hell happened to that? It's gone in this country. It's awful. There's this campaign out there. It's called Turn the Lights On. What an awful campaign. It should be turn the damn lights off. Have a conservation. If they don't need it, don't do it. Don't buy it. So that's my little political spiel right there. And it's not politically.
How do we get into every high school curriculum?
Right. Well, it's one by one. That's all, we don't have everything figured out at Cassie. We're a small nonprofit, but we just keep plinking away one step, one person at a time. Your work, Charlie, that's going to be a big, part of the answer to, we got to have more people interpreting the biophysical economics into more simple terms. And I think that's one of the things we try to do, that we do.
Well, we're making teaching modules with Rick Beal in Syracuse. So there's some hope to that. And I have, anybody wants it who's a teacher, a series of 8 lectures, videos, an hour each on energy and the economy. So we're doing what we can, but mostly we're just ignored for 50 years.
Yeah, it's well, I'll just say this as a word of encouragement for everybody out there. I really feel like $1 spent in sound ecological economics is worth $1 million of PR in perpetual growth theory or perpetual growth policy. They really are getting egg on their face, the politicians, when they're out there saying, oh, there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. In fact, you don't hear that as often because we've gone so hard after them. We, Cassie, Charlie, many of us, to put the lie to that nonsense.
I got to go. Here's a mechanic. Bye, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, bye, Charlie. Yep. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Raymond Lurie, please go ahead with your question. And next will be John Hollins.
Thanks, Nigel. Interesting presentation, Brian. There's 2 things. First thing is, I'm not understanding, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, but you seem to put agriculture and agricultural activity into a separate category that's apart from the rest of the economy. And from my perspective, if you look at a lot of economic activity, so for example, extraction of gas, which is then used to make hydrogen, which is used to make ammonia for fertilizer, there's a lot of the agricultural economy that's intertwined with the more generalized economy, right? So are you actually taking it out, or are you putting it in a way that I'm not understanding?
Well, I'm emphasizing that it is so integrated with all of the rest of the economy that you cannot have economic growth without more agricultural and extractive activity. I thought I was doing kind of the opposite of what you want. Yeah.
Okay, so we have the same understanding then on that. But the other thing that the other question I put there is that your numbers show a correlation. I think it's clear there's a correlation, right? But I don't see in your presentation, anyways, any evidence of the causation. And I'll just give you an example. of where I think there's not necessarily causation. So if you look at fisheries and some of the fisheries that are out there that were depleted before, many of them have recovered, and they're being exploited in a long-term sustainable way, meaning that, you know, if we continue exploiting at that rate, we'll keep on having as much of a harvest year after year after year. So in that sense, to me, that way of doing the fishing has a lot less of an ecological impact than what we used to do before, where we depleted those fisheries, right? So I don't necessarily see a straight causation between the two.
Well, I guess we don't have time remaining here, but I'll go back to those basic principles of ecology, and it can summarize the negative relationship between the growth of the human economy and biodiversity, including fish species, but all of it. It's due to the tremendous breadth of the human niche, which expands via technological progress. The human economy, Homo sapiens, its active grows at the competitive exclusion of non-human species in the aggregate. There are some winners, if you will, here and there, when they're very commercially valuable, especially for a while. You know, you can maintain stocks of certain fish species if you start developing aquaculture, and you know, and you are able to clean up a lake area. But Raymond, I'm sorry, that's not the war. Those are battles, conservation battles that are won here and there. Meanwhile, I think you must agree, if you're familiar with the fisheries literature and data, overall, our fisheries are not only declining, they're plummeting. And then we have the big, sort of the 800-pound gorilla. I hate to use that metaphor because that's the one I always use for economic growth itself. But we have the elephant in the room of global heating, which is unraveling ecosystems from the equator to the poles. So anything you see right now that may seem ecologically sustainable, I wouldn't bet the farm on it.
Yeah, so I understand that, you know, there is definitely a correlation, right? But if you look at fisheries and you
Not
read
just a correlation.
no, if you look,
when you look at the causes of species endangerment in the USA and around the planet, what are those causes? They're a who's who of the economy. They're the sectors of the economy. There's causation, but once again, look at the trophic structure of the human economy. There's your causal hypothesis for why growing GDP measures environmental impact, because of the trophic structure of the human economy. So it's not just a correlation, not at all. And I can send out literature for those who are interested on the trophic theory of money and this regression model. And no, we wouldn't have put that out there if it was just another correlation. It is entirely it started with the causal hypothesis that led to a regression, and not just a correlation analysis, but a regression model. We want to build on that. There needs to be a lot of building upon that in the literature, but we have the basic regression model, causally based. Causally based. Causally derived.
Okay, thank you. Our next question will come from John Hollins, and Mike Hanauer is on deck.
Well, thank you very much for your exposition today. I think back to the days when we had overhead projectors and a teacher could take a petri dish, a shallow glass dish with agar in it, throw a few bacteria in, dark colored ones, and watch them grow during the course of a lesson, so that by the time the lesson was over, the dish was completely black and it wasn't growing anymore. I don't know how all the economists in this world got through school without seeing that. It seems to me pretty obvious that on a finite planet, you can't grow forever. And how is ecological footprint measured? I've seen references to the fact that we need several planets, not just one. Are there you've produced a formula for calculating the ecological footprint, I presume, of the world. What units do you use? And are there other ways of measuring it that you can check one against the other?
Yeah, well, we're not the ones that calculate the ecological footprint. That the leader in that is the Global Footprint Network. And I'd be shocked if you haven't had somebody on KCOR from them yet, Mattis Wagernagel or somebody like that. I know you've had Bill Reese. One of the, the concept really stems from Bill Reese. And then his student, Mattis Wagernagel, really, went to town with it, with Dr. Reese. So they can tell you more about that, but essentially it's the methodology entails figuring out how much is required based upon the consumption of a person, of a town, of a city, of a country, of the planet. What's required for that economic activity? What is required of the earth? How much agricultural production, how much timber, how much fishery, etc. And that's how they calculate that. Your second question, what we did today was we showed that GDP is essentially measuring the same thing. It's measuring how much is required of our planet. It's equatable to via that regression equation, the ecological footprint. And there's a cause there. The causality is clear. The causality stems from the trophic reality of how an economy is and must be structured. It's not something that just is right now as we see it. It's a fundamental structure, just like the fundamental identity of national income accounting. It's not modifiable by some new technology. That is basic physics and ecology, that trophic structure.
The regression analysis you did came out as close to a square root of GDP as I think one could reasonably expect to get. Is there any theoretical backing to why it should that regression number should have occurred? Has there been any thinking about that?
Not enough. I would love to see the trophic theory of money be studied much more deeply, with more nuance. We've been able to plink away a little bit now and then with grad students and an ecological economist now and then on Cassie's staff, but there's some conceptual material that you're never going to find published in this decade or in this century in the economics journal, the journals of the American Economic Association. You might find them in the journal Ecological Economics. You should find them there. And then but that narrows the field tremendously in terms of who's going to see it, which graduate programs around the country are going to develop it, analyze it. So I'm very confident that the trophic theory of money will become standard stock in ecological macroeconomics. How long it takes to break through that iron triangle, around the macroeconomic policy arena that neoclassical economics forms as the professional side of, you might say. That's another matter. That kind of goes back to Charlie's question about how do we get there politically. So we just keep trying.
I wish you best wishes as you go to show that GDP is actually growth in GDP is a disaster not too far in the distant.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, one thing we like to I don't know, assuage people with or to help people to understand that we're not you know, some types of what's the word I'm looking for? You know, we're not just tree huggers or whatever that are looking for a return to caveman Luddites, whatever. We remind people that through, let's say, the 18th century, 19th century, and a good chunk of the 20th century, GDP growth was probably a real good thing. It was a real good thing. But, you know, just like the growth of a child, that's a really good thing. But when that child becomes an adult, continual growth, that's not a good thing. And so it's not like we're automatically opposed to GDP growth. We're just opposed to it when the planet's in overshoot. We do see the need for GDP growth in some parts of the planet, pockets of the planet, at least in some significant areas where real GDP growth is they're in dire need of it. That's why it's even more important for, let's call them fat economies, you know, like the American economy and Canadian economy and a number of others, to take the foot off the gas a little and start to help around the world a little more, so that we can have a peaceable community, in global community, with everybody having a reasonable standard of living. Otherwise, you know, it's not only going to be an environmental problem, it's going to be a national security, international stability problem. You know, we like to say at Cassie, not only is environmental protection a steady state economy, we like to say at Cassie, peace is a steady state economy.
Thank you. Okay, Mike Hanauer, please go ahead with your question. And on deck is Mike Nickerson.
Thank you so much, Brian, for all your work. I have kind of two related questions. I'll start with the second one because it touches on what Charlie and others have brought, that we live in a culture that says growth is good and growth will solve our problems. And this idea that GDP is a direct predictor of environmental decay seems to be a wonderful concept if we can get the world to see that. Perhaps making it simple with a formula similar to the iPad equation for population and consumption might be helpful to get it out there. Maybe I'm wondering if you've discussed this with Kate Rayworth and if she would buy into this, because she seems to have, you know, a lot of media, you know, where the rubber meets the road. I think we need to add teeth to what you've come up with, and make it quantifiable and make it almost a household accepted kind of thing. And even the iPad thing hasn't gotten there yet, so we know it's not easy. That's the first part. The other question I had is, it seems to me that being that technology, the more technology we do on a finite planet, the worse the side effects and the rarer things get. You know, certainly look at mining and the lithium and cobalt. And I'm wondering if it's not linear, if each delta of increased GDP is more environmentally destructive than a previous delta.
That's a great question. And You know, I tend to think you're right because as you go up in GDP, you're pulling out more of the stops for another increment of growth. Yeah. That's that's another indication of being beyond the optimum scale, I think. Yeah. Well, you're right on the money there, so to speak, I think, Mike.
Okay, Mike Nickerson, please go ahead.
Oh, hi, Brian. It's good to have you back and sharing what Casey's. You said a little while ago that like $1 spent on conservation is worth thousands of dollars spent on, building new roads or whatever. I tend to agree with the notion that the greenest dollar is the one not spent. And that's a different perspective. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
I agree. The greenest dollar is the one not spent. What I was getting at there wasn't so much about techniques as it was about politics and PR. I think that like Mike Hanauer just said, we need to get this out there, this kind of material, right? So we can't just not spend any on that. Some things have to be spent on while others aren't. And as we spend some money on this, the result should be, it better be, or it ought to be that other dollars are not spent on things like Hummers and McMansions and, that's why at Cassie, we work on things like the Luxury Cap Act and the Salaries Cap Act, and which that's our next one to come out in the Steady State Herald by our author Daniel Wartell London, who's also been on the Cape Corps. So yeah, but ecologically, Mike, I totally agree. You may recall, my first book was Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, and that was like the kind of the bottom line of it was
Stop
all
shoveling.
else equal, less spending, the better.
Yeah.
And that was the earliest sort of version of that trophic theory of money. I didn't have the trophic theory of money fleshed out back then, but I was thinking in trophic terms.
Yeah, the shifts between a non-consumer economy and the consumer economy, we boiled it down to more fun, less stuff. 4 syllables. I don't know if we can get any lower than that. It used to be a question of direction, but we need parallel lines. One is to moderate what's going on, and the other is to develop a culture that celebrates living and manages the material world. As you agree, we have to.
Yeah, that's a great slogan. Yeah, more fun, less stuff.
Okay, Claude Buechner, please go ahead with your question.
Yes,
Then Ted Manning, I think you have a further comment or question. You'll be next. Thank you.
yes, Brian, you convinced me to go sign that petition, and the website says, oops, you already signed it with that email address. So you must have convinced me in one of your earlier presentations. My question and comment actually refers to something in today's Star Tribune Minneapolis metro area paper. And it's based on a once every 5 years, the USDA puts out a report on number of farms, acres, et cetera. And I'm not particularly worried about the long-term trend of fewer farms, and they tend to be bigger and corporatized, because at some point in national emergency, they can all be nationalized, actually. Forgive me for being that blunt, but it's actually a good thing that we're efficient up to a point of not using too much hydrocarbon fertilizer. But what I found absolutely strange was that since 2017 to 2022, there are 20 million acres less farmland in 2022 in the US. And so my comment and question, because both the Limits to Growth and also the book Overshoot made a big deal about the per capita food production. And I know we have a surplus in the United States, but this is an erosion of our surplus. 20 million acres, and I believe off of memory, so this could be wrong, but I think that Reese always uses 0.4 hectares, which is 1 acre. per person is what is required. And if that's true, that's 20 million people that the US now cannot feed, either our own or shipping it to other parts of the world where it's really needed. So that's my comment, but it's also, I asked the question, is this actually the whole purpose of degrowth is so that we don't have an uncontrolled degrowth? But the evidence is there, it seems to me, if you want to admit that it's there, that we're actually seeing on the edges the beginnings of the uncontrolled degrowth.
Yeah, oh, totally. You bet it's a sign of that. And you know, some people might wonder, well, how can you continue growing that GDP when ag land is being reduced? Well, that's not a long-term phenomenon. You know, there's all kinds of stuff going on there. There's more international trade. There's sectoral readjustments of the American economy, and you know, there's the farm bill and the temporary incentives for growing versus putting into conservation for short periods. There's all kinds of stuff going on there, climate included. So, but I think the biggest message is, yeah, it's scary. And it is a sign of diminishing biocapacity. And the Global Footprint Network does find lessening biocapacity over time. So, but I also want to go to the first thing you said, because I always forget this. You know, I'm not a very good leader of a nonprofit organization in the sense that I don't get us some of the things we really need. And one of them is those signatures. So thank you for going back to sign it and finding that you had already signed it. If you already signed it, everybody out there that has signed it, please join Cassie. That's like the next step in getting this kind of stuff out there. We're a membership organization. It's only $30 to join, and we'll send a membership gift, a book. We have 5 books now off our Steady State Press. And so, yeah, please join Cassie, because that's the other thing that speaks to a politician is number of dues paying members.
Thank you.
Yes. And finally, Ted Manning, you had a comment or question.
Well, I have a couple
with that, and I think we'll finish off with this, and this will be the last exchange.
Okay, fair enough. Well, I can actually combine it with the thanks to Brian at the same time, because as long as my computer stays on, I'm still a victim of technology today. They're trying to upgrade my neighborhood. If I go to make it all the way through, I'm sure Nigel can finish. I was particularly impressed with the complexness, shall we say, of the questions that came up today. Brian, you definitely stimulated everyone to get involved. And it always strikes me, I like the notion of going back to the idea of footprint and relating it to impacts of people. One observation I had was it's so dependent on our own assumptions regarding consumption patterns. And ultimately, it's probably going to be very culturally dependent in different parts of the world, contingent totally on their own expectations, whether they remain similar to where they came from or whether they try to emulate the most advanced ones in the world. It is going to be a difficult thing to really address, but it's worth talking about. And I will end by saying that there are at least 3 people we know we could bring on in the next few sessions, in the next few months. Mathis Wageningen is a member of the Club of Rome, and he is prepared, I think, to talk to us. We definitely have had Bill Rees on before. I think it's useful fairly soon to ask him back again with some very specific questions like these. And the third one would be Hunter, what's her name? Hunter Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute, where she's been doing an awful lot of stuff on reducing the impact of farming, and particularly looking at restorative methods for the American farmscape, but also possibly relevant for other countries. So all of those, I would propose that we think about inviting on in the next few months to address the very kinds of questions that we brought up today. So coming back to my thanks to Brian, the fact that we got so many good questions is a very good indicator of success for us. And it definitely stimulates people to come back next time and follow them through with the people who know very specific things that can add to them or have new dimensions. So again, thank you ever so much. And I think this is about the point where we put on the commercial, isn't it? Very much like your commercial, Brian. And please take Brian up on it too. The more we link with people who know stuff and we can share it, the better. This is our commercial. It essentially says, please join us. Please belong if you wish. It's $100 a year. It gets you access to all of these very interesting presentations. And we also have them available for everyone who wants to follow up ones they haven't had a chance to see, the ones that are now on our YouTube channel. And if you just subscribe when you're watching us on YouTube, it gives us some benefits in terms of being able to have the program continue. So thank you again for coming. And we have another one next week, which will also be very interesting. And I'm sorry, who's on next week? I forgot to look. Do you know? Okay, that's okay. They'll tell us in a minute. So anyway, we can now turn our